Thank you again to everybody for inviting me to speak today. It's wonderful to be back. I was here a year ago, and actually it's amazing just how much we've achieved in the last year. I mean, those of you who were here as well, probably if you think back to how much wasn't formed and sorted, how much more policy we had to get through. We had a bill, not an act, how much all of you on the ground were doing in order to try and ensure that you got your CCGs up and ready to go. And so I think for us to have got from where we were then to a point now whereby we have 212 clearly identified CCGs coming into being, coming ready, coming forward to be authorised, covering the whole country and including every practice in the whole country, and an NHS Commissioning Board which is starting to form, and all the rest of the architecture. I think it's absolutely marvellous, and I congratulate you, because actually I know just how much work so many people in this room will have done to get us there. What I thought I'd try and do this afternoon is just kind of a reminder, a bit of a whistle-stop tour of all the broad aspects that are going on, and then some insight into some of the latest thinking around issues regarding clinical commissioning, thinking in the department, across the department and the Commissioning Board Authority. I am National Managing Director of Commissioning Development in the Board Authority. I have the same title, I think, in the Department of Health, and so there'll be that kind of double running up until the new system completely comes into being on April the 1st, 2013. So if I can just start by reminding everybody, because I do think it's worth going back to it all the time, what's the object of the exercise in all these reforms in this new policy? 3 key planks to the reform which have absolutely stood the test of time. Patients and their communities absolutely at the heart of everything we do, with much more empowerment and much more responsibility of those patients and the communities. Based on clinical leaders, much more clinical engagement in commissioning, much more clinical inclusion in leadership and decision making, on the grounds that those clinical leaders should be well placed to be the voice of patients, the public. They can never be the voice of patients, the public. We need that voice for itself, but ensuring that those clinical leaders are at the heart of everything we do. And then the final plank, making sure that what we do is evidence-based, that we look for evidence-based outcomes, particularly across the 3 domains of quality, patient safety, clinical effectiveness, and patient experience, and that what we do is determinedly delivering better evidence-based outcomes across those 3 domains. So that's the basis, and on that basis we start to see a slightly changing architecture, a diversity of providers, so more providers who can deliver great services for patients, encouraged to be in the market, more empowerment for traditional NHS providers through the Foundation Trust changes, and the way we do our contracting and making sure that actually we lever the best outcomes for patients through the way that we deal with the range of providers. Secondary care providers who are not yet Foundation Trusts will be overseen by a new National Trust Development Agency until they become Foundation Trusts, at which point they become much more autonomous and are actually overseen by Monitor, who is one of the regulators, the other big regulator, of course, being CQC, who will be responsible for regulating the quality of care for all providers in the NHS. So that's kind of the change to the provider landscape, but I'm going to concentrate on the commissioning landscape, and I'll start with reminding everybody just how much commissioning of public health services will be done in a different way. I do think it's important to remember that local authorities will be responsible for commissioning local public health services, which particularly will mean that those local enhanced services that practices have been delivering, which are public health enhanced services, that funding will go to local authorities. But local authorities also, undertaking all that public health commissioning, which was once done by PCTs. We've also got Public Health England, who will commission a number of public health services at national level, so it'll be responsible for a broad range of areas, but including some specific areas such as screening and immunisation, which although Public Health England will have the funding for initially and will define the quality standards, it will delegate, we think, much of that commissioning to the NHS Commissioning Board, in that will be the kind of expert commissioning body. So we've got quite a significant sum of NHS money actually with local authorities and Public Health England. But for NHS commissioning, the key bodies are obviously the CCGs and the NHS Commissioning Board itself. And I'll start with CCGs, many of you will have heard me say, so I'll say it very quickly, why CCGs, why based on the practices? Is this not, people say, is it not too GP focused, too primary care focused? But I think what we must not underestimate is this amazing place that general practice as a unit has in relation to patients and the public. So the number of patients who are seen in general practice, not just by GPs, by a whole range of staff, is absolutely enormous. So that ability of the general practice unit to understand what patients are experiencing of services is very significant indeed. And then, of course, the majority of general practices deal with a specific registered population and have an affinity for that population and a huge stability with that population, and know that community and population well. So again, have a really good understanding of what the population needs are as well as the individual patient needs. So this is the basis on which CCGs are built. With the practices as members, there are unique organisations in the NHS. Normally the NHS builds organisations from the top down. So, the Secretary of State identifies somebody to be the chairman, who then identifies the rest of the non-executives, who then identifies the executive team, etc., etc. Whereas CCGs are organisations made up of the membership practices who then have to decide how to govern themselves, how to operate, describe their governing body, work out how they're going to work between themselves. A very different model and perhaps more akin to the private sector, where you have shareholders who identify a board, but the board accounts to the shareholders. And I do think it's really important to remember that the kind of accountability of the CCG is dominantly to its patients and its public, and you have to find an open and transparent way of doing that. But the way that it does that accounting is through the governing body, who also, of course, accounts to the membership practices who have elected and selected, identified, however they do it, that particular governing body. I think it's really important. General practice is multidisciplinary anyway, and it's really important to remember that, and for everyone to remember the enormous role that the broad range of clinical professionals need to play in delivering clinical commissioning. In exactly the same way as GPs and practice staff, they don't deliver all the care for patients themselves, they coordinate it. That unique coordinating, having all the information, navigating patients. There's an analogy there to the commissioning. So the GP practice is the coordinating unit. But good commissioning is simply about ensuring that all relevant parties come to the table to determine what are the best services for the population. And those stakeholders, as well as local patients and the public, must include all the relevant clinicians from primary and secondary care and tertiary and other sectors who actually need to come together, social care colleagues, and work out what the best shape of the services are, so that you can then go on and contract for those services and then monitor them. I always think commissioning, fairly simple, very complex, but you can 3 simple bits: planning, agreeing, monitoring. And the way that is done, the kind of clinical elements of planning as well as the public health elements of planning are, that's the huge bit where we need all the stakeholders. When you get into the sort of securing those services through contracting or monitoring that the quality has been delivered, they become exercises where the inclusion of stakeholders it's less important. It's still important, but it's less important. So that's why CCGs are at the heart of everything we do, and that's why CCGs are responsible for local services, but that's why we've been very clear in the authorisation process that we want to see CCGs who are really, really very inclusive of everyone in the community. CCGs commission the vast majority of local services, but obviously when the Act was being deliberated, there was, there was a view that it would be inappropriate for CCGs to commission primary care services, given that the commissioners would be from primary care. We would have had a situation if they'd done that where actually they wouldn't have been able to operate because, as the gentleman from Beechcroft said, everybody would be leaving the room all the time because they had a conflict of interest. So the majority of primary care services delivered will be commissioned by the NHS Commissioning Board. And as well as that, the NHS Commissioning Board will commission specialised services because of the complexity and the size of geography across which specialised services are commissioned. Part of the tenet about local services being commissioned by CCG is what has led to the decision that what are commonly known as local enhanced services, the funding for that will be devolved to the CCGs because they are about locally sensitive, community-based services. And actually the way those services are commissioned needs to map onto the rest of the services. Now this is one element and one area where CCGs are likely to have a conflict of interest in some of their decisions. So it's not everything they do, but as Beechcroft, I heard some of the lecture before, and we'll be going to be shortly issuing some guidance on conflict of interest and a framework to help you on that. You will need to have the right things in place so that when you are commissioning services that could be delivered by general practices or could only be delivered by general practices, that actually you've got the mechanisms for conflict of interest to deal with that. And if I can just say, for the record on local enhanced services, because it's quite topical at the moment, the rules around how these services are procured or contracted have not changed. They will be the same for CCGs as they are for PCTs. So in other words, if you have a service that a broad range of providers could deliver, then you are legally obliged to ensure that that broad range of services, that those providers have access to bid to deliver those services. If you have a set of services for which you need to be the registered list holder in order to deliver the services, then you can do a single tender because you've got evidence that actually there aren't any other people who could deliver the services. So the rules don't change around that. CCGs will have to adhere to the same rules that PCTs did, but they will have to have mechanisms in place for where they have a conflict of interest. So the board itself will commission those services, and in designing the board, we've been very conscious that we wanted to have something that was first very, very clinically led, and I hope you will see that for the first time 3 of the executive directors of the board have very long-standing clinical careers. I was practicing clinical medicine for 25 years, with several years as a hospital doctor and 20 or so years as a GP. I know you can say that I must have started when I was very young. Bruce Keogh has many, many years of experience as being as a secondary care consultant, and Jane Cummings, many, many years as a clinical nurse. So I think between us we worked out we've probably got somewhere near 70 years of clinical experience. So the board, like the clinical commission groups, trying to replicate that clinical focus. And also in the way the board operates, what we're wanting to do is to have a new culture, is to have a new way of operating and working with CCGs in partnership. To be honest, the Act does change the nature of the relationship between the national support system, which we see the board as being, and the more frontline clinical commissioners. It is not possible to manage the system the way we did when we had PCTs and SHAs, because some of the changes are enshrined in the Act. But irrespective of the Act, I can promise you that there is an absolute commitment from the NHS Commissioning Board to work in partnership with the CCGs, and that partnership will be very, very important, and to work in partnership with local health and wellbeing boards and local authorities as one of a number of players who bring together expertise, responsibility and accountability for the local population. So the NHS Commissioning Board's local area teams, there are going to be 4 broadly 4 regions, but these will be teams who kind of face the regions, and by no means as big an organisation, bigger teams as we've had in SHAs. Of course, they're not organisations at all. The board has a single operating model. There's only one decision-making body in the board, and that's the board of the board itself. But the 4 regions, but most importantly, the 27 local area teams who will have a responsibility for commissioning primary care and specialised services on the patch. So we'll need to work as a partner with CCGs to make sure that those services are integrated. But similarly, we'll have a responsibility for holding CCGs to account in order to ensure that they've delivered the outcomes within the financial resource available. So that's the new landscape. There are, I do want to mention one other really critical important area, and that's the commissioning support services. As I go around the country and talk to CCGs, I sense a growing determination to use commissioning support services, much less of an anxiety that commissioning support services were somehow a reinvention of one of the tiers of the NHS, and acceptance because of the way CCSSs behave, that these are, the CCGs are their customers. CCGs will have all the money, will be able to decide what to do, what they do in-house and what they want to buy from commissioning support services, and you will have the power of being the customer. And I think the power of being the customer is absolutely enormous. And I do think that in these very cash-strapped times in terms of running costs, there will be many, many things that even for the biggest CCG, you can do much more expertly and much more cost effectively if you use the economies of scale of a commissioning support service. So the NHS Commissioning Board is going to host those services for the short term. The NHS Commissioning Board is absolutely committed to ensuring that, as the policy plan, that they become freestanding organisations by 2016. But there was a view that in the early days, to provide some stability for the people forming these organisations, the board needed to host as an employer. But they will be hosted absolutely at arm's length from the rest of the board business, and the local area teams will not oversee the commissioning support system, which will be coming down a different channel, because obviously the local area teams will be holding CCGs to account, and the CCGs would be the CSS customers, so that would be a conflict of interest. So I think the CSS is really important. The other thing that we're doing in the department and in my directorate, because my new directorate in the Commissioning Board will have responsibility for development and support of clinical commissioning groups, the national picture on that and the kind of thought leadership on that. Obviously the day-to-day oversight and development will be channeled through the operations directorate, but will work in a matrix way. The same for commissioning support organisations, that thought leadership on that. Coordination and thought leadership on primary care, including the national contracts, but as well as that, the kind of air traffic control role in terms of tools, guidance and frameworks for CCGs that the Commissioning Board will produce. We won't by any means produce all the tools, commission guidance, that will be done by other directorates in the board, but we'll make sure that we'll do some of it ourselves, but make sure there's a consistent approach, a framework, a reasonableness, and that actually it's channeled through to CCGs in a way which supports and helps them. Got another couple of things coming out over the next few days on which you'll be interested. I think the assessor's guide for authorisation is out, and I think there's quite, even if you're not an assessor, if you're being authorised, there'll be quite a bit of useful information in that. And two other areas that you should see shortly are one on conflicts of interest and managing that and commissioning from primary care, and then one on how we work as collaborative commissioners. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm sorry it's such a whistle-stop tour, because to be honest it is the kind of thing that I probably could talk for the full hour on, but what I think is more important is to leave sufficient time for you to ask questions so that I can tailor what I say to what you want to hear.
Thank you, Barbara. I think that's a good expose of where we are, and as is obvious, this is a really quite rapidly changing landscape with new guidance coming out regularly. new processes coming out which are making things clearer, but I think there is a philosophy here around hands-off, which is very, very different to what we have been used to. So paradoxically, the loads of stuff coming out from the centre is really delineating how the centre isn't getting involved. And I think that is a really fundamental change, and it's very, very welcome. So let's get some questions in, and hands up, please, so I can identify them. Identify that question in the front and a question further back to start with. So could we have the roving mics, please? And let's take the first question.
Hi, yes. Stephen Dorrell in an earlier session showed a concern with regards to commissioning more of the same, but better. And there was a discussion around the introduction of innovation to be able to mitigate that risk. So the question is, what is the Commissioning Board's view for how to introduce innovation into the service?
Do you want me to answer that?
Questions first? That's probably best because there'll be quite a few. Let's get them in twos. There's a second question right in the front here. So we'll just pass, for expediency, it's probably easiest. We'll just pass that question.
Lutfi Kamal, GP from Wakefield. You've talked about commissioning. One thing you have not talked about is the contract for GPs being held by your commissioning board. When will you free us from the stranglehold PCT had on general practice over the years? When will that change so that we can go away and do the best we can for our patients and get on with the job of commissioning?
Well, answer that one.
Okay, answer that one. Lufty and I know each other for many, many years. I wouldn't have expected any less a difficult question from him. Innovation is something the board is taking really very seriously. One of the directors in the board has, innovation as a key plank, Jim Easton, of what he's doing. We want to create a national improvement body, which is different from anything we've seen before and tries to work out how we can get all the great innovation that's coming up from the ground and make sure we spread good practice, because actually it's probably not the ideas we're short of, it's how do we spread them at the time that they come about. What I would say, however, though, is CCGs have got an enormous opportunity on innovation because they've got a very big budget. They've got a very big budget and the ability to make the decisions about which innovations they want to pump prime, which ones they want to see going forward. General practice and the contract, I'm afraid that in this world, you not only have to do the right thing, you have to be seen to do the right thing. And I don't believe there will ever be a time when any provider of healthcare does not have a very specific contract for what is expected of them, what are the outcomes for patients. The GP contract is, leading edge in terms of how much of it is actually based on outcomes within the resource available. The contract will be negotiated nationally as ever. The local area teams of the Commissioning Board will be there to ensure that that contract is delivered. I hope it will be done because of the single operating model. I hope that will be done in the best practice way. If you look around at how PCTs have managed the contract, some have done it brilliantly and have levered great change by doing the oversight in a supportive and developmental way. Some seem to have taken not very much notice of it at all, and some seem to have done it in a way which has actually not necessarily got the best results out of people. So the new operating model that's just come out, I think, is very much based on how can the local area teams actually work in the way the best PCTs have done to get the best out of those contracts.
Thank you. I mean, that's the first set of questions. Just an observation about the innovation piece, because it's quite interesting. In the US, there are a whole series of awards around innovation, but it's not around the process of innovation, because we all, because of what we do, are part of that, but around the people who are smart enough to innovate, not where they come from, but somewhere else. And I think that is something to bear in mind. The real innovators are the people who manage to transfer, rather than perhaps the people who actually innovate themselves. Next set of questions, both in the middle, both, which is helpful. So the one in the front first, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Francis, co-chair Norwich CCG. I'll probably ask the same question I asked at the plenary yesterday, but you're probably better because you probably made the decisions. It's somewhat frustrating for some of the policy to be made on the hoof too late. Two examples. One, we've advertised, we shortlisted for the nurse on the governing body, and then hey-ho, discovered it can't be a local provider, it can't be primary care, because primary care nurses apparently nowhere near as good an experience as secondary care nurses. The other irritating one is on premises, when we and others moved in with our district councils. We're virtually coterminous, ticked all the right boxes, fantastic relationships, but no, go and find some NHS premises. So we're looking at parts of the community hospital which are totally unsuitable for purpose. The third one, I think, is something about the supposed new style of the National Commissioning Board. Having been at annual accountability meeting recently, having seen some of the names around who've managed to get regional jobs, perhaps people have changed, but we'll see. But I think there was a real opportunity to get some of the new people coming through with perhaps the more collegiate, developmental, supportive style than many of us have been used to in PCT jobs over the past few years.
Thank you. I think the point's made. A question at just behind, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. Kirit Mistry from Derby Race and Equality Commission. The question is, really, how is the Commissioning Board going to be ensuring that equality is embedded within, obviously, the way the CCGs operate? And particularly, what indicators or performance indicators are the board or DOH setting to ensure that's going to be embedded?
Okay, thank you. I'll just take the first question on the governing body. Two things I think I would say is, the makeup and the nature of the governing body was in the government's response to the Future Forum, which is it was some considerable while ago. It was very clear then that the nurse and the doctor, the secondary care doctor, should not come from a provider with whom the CCG did regular business. So, I think it was inevitable that the regulations were going to go on and say that. I mean, my apologies that sometimes these things take time and the final absolute decision, and I think there were lots of people who kept saying, surely you aren't going to say that. But, I think the clues were there a long time ago. It also said that, the idea of these individuals on the governing body was to bring a different perspective. So I would absolutely deny that the nurse on the governing body not coming from primary care means that we don't value primary care nursing, because actually what we've said is that the practices can have as many people of whatever kinds they want on the governing body. So if practices do not value primary care nursing, then they won't give primary care nurses a seat on the governing body, is what I might suggest. The idea of the nurse and the nurse on the governing body in that specific was that we felt it was important that a different perspective. There was a huge opportunity from the practices to bring the primary care perspective, whereas actually what it was important was to have a nurse that brought a different perspective. And obviously the conflicts of interest is the reason for why they can't come from a local provider. On premises, again, the NHS is committed. If the NHS has a commitment to pay money for certain premises, then actually, and if that's enshrined in a contract, then that commitment's going to continue, and actually it'll be your budget that actually loses that. There's only one pot of money. So I think all everybody said, we haven't said you must do this A, B, C or D, because we're trying to be as Charles suggests, but what we've said is if you want to use somewhere other than NHS premises, you're going to have a really good business case as to why that is the case. And if you move to a different set of premises, and actually there's still a huge penalty to move out of another NHS premises, that doesn't feel really fair on the taxpayers to me. Race and equality is an absolutely great question, and something that I think is so important, and the board is absolutely committed to reducing inequalities of all kinds and a commitment to equality and diversity. I think it's really important to remember firstly that the CCGs are statutory bodies, and therefore that they will have a huge range of obligations on equality and diversity, which they legally are obliged to deliver. So in terms of our development and support for them, we'll be making that very clear, and as part of the authorisation we'll be looking at that. But what I really hope is that that motivation does seem to be there, and therefore actually these statutory bodies will will take it on themselves to be very serious about it. We've certainly been working recently with the Commission for Racial Equality on their new regulations about kind of oversight bodies. They call them boards, you know, we call them governing bodies, but you know, how you should deal with that. So there's a range of things on equality and diversity where not only it's not always only about holding to account, it's often about giving people the right tools and the right support and development to do it themselves.
Okay, thank you. Next set of 2 questions, both in the middle.
Okay.
One there and one in the front. Start in the back.
Hi, my name's Jamie. I'm from the National Rheumatoid Arthritis Society. It's just a question about commissioning advice, because I'm aware that there's a large number of bodies potentially now involved in providing advice on service redesign, so the clinical senates, the clinical networks, and the commissioning support services. And I just wondered whether there was some sense of how clinical commissioning groups are going to prioritise that advice. And also a second question, which is how you think the third sector can get involved in helping to support clinical commissioning groups commission better quality services.
Good, thank you. And the question in the front, please. Yes, you, sir.
Yes, thank you. Roger Pinnock, Ashford CCG Chair. My job on returning to Ashford was to have been to sack our primary care nurse from our governing body. She had realised that the regulations didn't allow her to be there and didn't want to be a non-voting member. Could I be quite clear from what you've said that if the practices chose to elect a practice nurse as a practice representative, that would be acceptable? Thank you.
Shall I answer that one first, because it's a simple question? Practices can have whoever they want on the governing body. It's their organisation. They decide how many people there are in total on the governing body, what is the makeup of those people. All we've said is that in addition to the people you choose, and by all means choose a practice nurse, you need to have 2 lay members, one of whom can do the financial things and one of whom can oversee. They're not the patient and public representative. One person can't do that. They oversee that the process for public and patient representation is proper, and then the nurse and the doctor. It's only those 4 roles. Outside that you can have whosoever you wish.
Okay, that's reasonably clear in terms of the potential, I think. And, and the other question.
I do think that one of the things, you know, just if I can just remind, I think that local councillors, it will not be okay for local councillors to be on the governing body. It'd be okay for local authority employees, but local councillors probably seen as should be on the Health and Wellbeing Board. The other question, yes, and I'm sorry, when you haven't got time, you always realise there's a really big important bit you've missed out, and of course the clinical senates and clinical networks absolutely key. I think the networks will be very much as we've seen in the past. What we're going to try and do is help support local communities to broaden the networks. Thus far we've seen enormously successful cancer and cardiac and stroke networks, but you know, we want to give money to local communities to support as many networks as they see fit. So I think that some of those are services that have less of a network will be able to have a local network to work on that basis. The senates, there'll be a relatively small number of senates. We've sort of said 12 to 15, multidisciplinary. And I think taking a broad overview when the differences, the changes that you make to all the different bits of the system and the client groups or the ologies actually come together so that the Senate can look at the kind of whole impact on shape of services. But you are right, they're both advisory for CCGs. Where I think that third sector groups have got a great deal to offer in terms of commissioning support. Some of it just maybe being part of those clinical networks or parts of clinical cabinets, because, you know, actually all we've said is the overarching senates and networks that the board will provide the funding to support is what the board, you know, they're the big national ones. Most CCGs are bound to have senates and networks of their own that are much nearer home. They might call them a different name. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But my general advice to third sector who want to sort of get into commissioning support, and I'm happy to help if you want to let me have your name later to put you in contact, is that you are probably best working working with some of the established being established NHS Commissioning Support Services, because that means that actually you're not having to deal with 212 CCGs. You can work through them, and we've got some great examples of voluntary sector organisations with massive expertise who are already starting to kind of put that expertise alongside the bigger organisation that can umbrella and help them, and I think that would be great.